Hey guys, hey, we've got Donice Noelle Smith here. She's the candidate for Oregon's governor, and she is the Constitutional Party, which is close to Republican, right? And so we've got her here to ask some questions and talk about some things and get her views on some things and yeah, so we can all just know what's up. So, Donis, what would you, let's see, what would you like to start with? You like to tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, and your history a little bit, and how you got, if you can kind of just real quickly tell us how you got from where you started to here, running for governor for Oregon.
My goodness. Well, first of all, I want to be able to give acknowledgement to my husband, J.C. Smith, because I couldn't be able to do this without his support and the love and support of my family and some of my closest friends and extended family. I was originally born in California, and I was raised in a family of 5 kids. I was the oldest, and my sister was the youngest and the 5th one. She was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which was a hereditary disease. You have to have both parents have the recessive gene in order for your child to have CF. And generally, if you have 4 children, 1 child will have the disease, 1 child will be free of not even carrying the recessive gene, and 2 of the others might have the recessive genes. And what was interesting is she was the 5th and last child, and she had the disease. And we lost her when she was 5 and a half due to malpractice. There was a nurses' strike going on, and the nurses were talking about better patient care, and it was really about more money again and benefits. And they had some people come in to fill the shoes of these nurses that were not really up on what was going on, and there was a lot of miscommunication. And my sister was so stressed out from the nurses' strike and not having her aunties there in taking care of her in the hospital when she went in for her next pulmonary washout, that she ended up developing an ulcer. And those people that know about ulcers know that not only do children get ulcers, not only do adults get ulcers, but so do children. And yet in those days, in the 60s, they said, oh, children don't get ulcers. They don't get stressed out enough to get ulcers. Well, they were wrong. My sister developed an ulcer, and they gave my sister a medication. I think it was called cortisone. And you don't give that to an adult that has an ulcer, because what happened to my sister is what would happen to an adult. Her ulcer exploded, and she hemorrhaged to death in my mother's arms in the hospital. And there was no way to stop the hemorrhaging. That's kind of what made me look at the medical field, and the fact that later on, years later, my grandfather died due to malpractice. Someone jumped up on top of him, not realizing he was blind, and that his hearing aids had fallen out when he fell. And so he couldn't hear what was going on. He couldn't communicate very well. And they jumped up thinking that he had stopped breathing, and all he had done was suck in the air because he had a broken rib. And the guy jumped up on top of the table in the hospital, did CPR incorrectly, and pushed his stomach up through the diaphragm, puncturing the diaphragm. And he ended up with gangrene and died in the hospital with the gangrene all throughout his body. So that was 2 cases of malpractice right there. Yeah. So I became, I went in the medical field in the Army. I volunteered for Vietnam in 1974, 2 weeks out of high school, to be a combat medic. I had some relatives caught in Vietnam that had 2 children, and we wanted to get them out of Vietnam, and I was going to go over there and help with that, and also help with what we call the Amerasian Baby Lift operation, which is bringing the children that were half American, both black and white children that were half American, half Vietnamese. In some cultures, if you are part American and part Vietnamese, you're not really accepted by either culture over there. And so they were helping bring these children out of Vietnam while Vietnam was falling.
Were they bringing them here to the States?
They were bringing them here to the United States. And so I was going to be one of the medics on one of the airplanes doing the airlift to get the Amerasian children out of Vietnam, and also bring home our soldiers, the ones that were injured, who were wounded over there. At the last minute, the military had other plans for me, and they ended up, while I was on my way to Southeast Asia to Vietnam, they sent me to Korea. So I was in Korea when Vietnam fell. and I was assigned to the 121 Evacuation Hospital as my first assignment. My second assignment was the 560th, which was part of the original MASH unit left over from the days of the Korean conflict. We don't call it a war because it was not a declared war, it was a conflict where we were fighting the North Koreans and the Chinese. And that's when my two fathers were over there in the 50s. So here I am in 74 on my way to South Korea. And my first assignment was the 121 Evacuation Hospital, where I was assigned to the psychiatric ward. And I became a psychiatric corpsman or technician. And there were both closed wards and open wards. And we dealt with the drug addictions, the alcohol addictions of our soldiers that had just come out of the jungle, who were brought from Vietnam straight to South Korea before they were brought home. So that was where my training in the medical
you have
field.
Some experience with drug addiction and things like that.
Yeah, I was 19 when I started that. So
And
I
mental
tell
health.
people I cut my baby teeth in the psychiatric field there at the 121 Evacuation Hospital in Seoul, Korea. Yes.
Wow. How long were you in the military?
Well, I went in originally for 3 years, and I stayed for 4 active duty the first time. And then during the space of the other 31 years, I did some more active duty. So I've done a total of 10 years of active duty. And I did about 4 to 6 years of the National Guard in both Hawaii, California, and some in Oregon. And the rest were all active Army Reserve, actually in boots. So out of 40-something years in the military, because I got out in 2002 for 5 years. So they put me in what they call the inactive reserve, where you don't wear the uniform, you don't wear the boots, you don't drill, you don't get paid. But in between the 2002 when I got out and the 2007 when I came back in, when I got out in 2002, I already had over 28 years in boots.
Wow.
And so I got out for 5 years. I came back in for a short time, found myself on active duty, found myself in the Wounded Warrior Transition Program, underwent a couple surgeries, did a little bit more active duty, and then in 2014, I went back into the active Army Reserve, and I was assigned, I was living here in Oregon, of course, which is the home of some of my ancestors, and then I was drilling in California, so I meant driving 9 hours one way and out of state to go to my weekend drills and be gone all weekend long and then come back. And so they actually retired me out at age 60 in 2015.
So all in all, you've spent
35 years.
35 years
35
in
years.
the military, around the military, being around soldiers and sergeants and all kinds of operations, going overseas and just being
I did a
part
small-
of that military
I did a
world.
small stint in Germany. It was a very short stint, but it was very interesting because while I was in Germany, I have some German ancestry. I have some Irish ancestry too. And I learned that there was things going on in Germany that I discovered were going on here in the U.S. where they were discovering they were losing their country the way we're losing our country now. And this was in the 90s when I had my short stint overseas in Germany. I wasn't there very long. I was there just to relieve some people that wanted to go on R&R back home. So I've been to Korea, I've been to Germany, I've been to Slovakia, which used to be called Czechoslovakia. I had a day there, and it was right after communism had fallen. It was after the wall came down in Berlin. And so I saw what the people in Czechoslovakia, how they had lived under communist rule. And they were just trying to climb out of that. So, yeah.
Oh, what made you decide to run for governor? I guess that's really what I want to ask.
It's been a process. It's been a journey. It's not something that I just went into and decided to wake up one day I was going to do this. Years ago, right after we moved back up here to Oregon, we were living in Coos Bay and then North Bend, and then we moved to Douglas County. And some ladies I met through the League of Women's Voters had walked up to me, and they'd heard about my background, and they said, you know what, we really think you ought to think about running for governor. And this was about 18, 19 years ago, and I'm like, yeah, right, okay. That, you know, I had sort of kicked around the idea of running for Congress and
So
or
they
running.
planted the seed.
Yeah, it was kind of like a fantasy, but I'd kind of kicked the idea about running for governor. only when they offered me the books. And then I took these books they gave me and I took them home and I go, maybe someday, that's kind of a fantasy thing. But I had been the assistant campaign manager for someone who had been running for Congress of the United States, and we actually sent him to Congress. And so then years later, I found myself helping bring our sheriff into position where he became our sheriff of our county. We had a couple people that were running for county commissioner. One of them, she's a rancher with her husband, and they train horses. And she then later on, after she was our county commissioner, she was running for U.S. Senate. And I, for a very short time, had been asked to be the campaign manager for a gentleman who was running for county commissioner. He did not get it. He did not get elected. But I was only his campaign manager for like less than a month, because he came to me way too late for us to really do anything. And then 2 years ago, I was asked to be the campaign manager for a gentleman who was running for U.S. Senate against Joe Ray Perkins. And I didn't know a lot about him, except he was a veteran like myself, so I didn't really vet him thoroughly. And I don't think he really vetted me very well either. And so, but he approached me 3 months before the May 2020 election and asked me to be his campaign manager. And all I can say is that it was not a good fit. And if I had to do all over again, I probably would have said no. I myself personally chose at the end of that 3 months, in May of 2020, I and every member of my family voted for Joe Ray Perkins, even though I was his campaign manager, because I could not in good conscience, with what I had learned and what I experienced, I could no longer vote for him, even though I was his quote-unquote campaign manager. Lavoy Finnegan, who was murdered a few years ago, assassinated here in Oregon, told us it matters how you stand. And you cannot do something that goes against your grain, against your values, against your principles. And so, again, a few months ago, when Joe Ray Perkins ran for U.S. Senate in the primary, our whole family voted for her again. And this coming week, we're all going to vote for Joe Ray Perkins again for the third time, because we really believe she cares about Oregonians. She cares about what is going on in the state. And I've seen this woman since May of 2020, literally working it from all over the state, everywhere. And she truly cares about going to Washington, D.C. and representing Oregonians. So she has been very inspirational. So when I was approached to run as a nominee for governor with the Constitution Party, knowing that they did, that I've been a Republican all my life. I'm still a Republican in my heart. But the Republican Party has abandoned us. As somebody said to me in Washington, D.C., and he's also living in Las Vegas, he said the Oregonian Republican Party and the Democrat Party in Oregon are captured operations. And he doesn't see that the Republican Party or the Democrat Party here in Oregon will ever come out of what we are going through right now until they change their ways. And right now, they are so caught up in the same old, that we don't see that ever that's going to change. The Constitution Party is made up of people that are Christians or spiritual. It's the same thing. Some are more religious than others, who are in the Constitution Party as Republicans, because they believe we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to God and country. And they believe that God, family, and country are the most important. And their motto is life, liberty, and limited government. And I'm all for that. I'm for limited government, and I'm for less government overreach, and I am for term limits. I believe in term limits. I believe that when people are in there too long, they become wealthy because of the favors they're doing for lobbyists and other big corporations, and then they get more money because they're bought and sold.
We see that everywhere, don't we?
We see that everywhere. And then when they're in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, like Peter DeFazio was, they end up becoming corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, it becomes all about the money.
Yeah, and so again, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I am all for term limits. And that includes myself. If I was ever elected into office and people said, okay, you've done your 4 years or you've done your 8 years, then you bow out gracefully and you let the new blood in, the young blood in, the new fresh ideas. The longer you're in, the more stale you're going to get, and the more likely you're going to forget where you came from and who you're supposed to be representing. You are a servant to the people. And most of our leadership in Oregon and around the country have forgotten that they are there to serve the people. They are there to follow the will of the people and not have what some people are calling mobocracy or mob rules. We can't have it where the majority feel that because we're the majority, we can tell everybody else how to live their lives.
Right. So, if you get elected, what are your plans for Oregon?
Well, there's three main things I want to look at. I want to look at what's going on with our jobs, our inflation, and the gas prices, many of them being artificially increased, homelessness, and then I want to be able to address issues like what's going on with our natural resources and what's happening with our education system. So let's start with homelessness first, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I believe that the homelessness that we are experiencing is getting worse. And it's getting worse for many different reasons. One of the main reasons is because of the fact, and JC and I have been traveling all over Eastern Oregon. We have gone to places that, from what I'm understanding, no gubernatorial candidates are even willing to go to. And I'm not just talking about this election. I'm talking about the elections previous to this one. And what it is I'm hearing from people in Harney County, up in Burns, in Hines. I'm hearing from people in Baker City. I've been to Baker City now in the last couple of months. I've been there 3 or 4 times. We've been to the town of Enterprise twice. We've been to Joseph. We've been up to a place which is it's an indigenous reservation, which is above Joseph. I hope I'm not going to butcher this. Imniwa. Okay. The whole county is Wawawa. And the people up there are saying that Salem forgets them. They figure that they're not worthy to really have a consideration. The gubernatorial candidates don't go there because of the fact they say that's not where our big populous voting base is. Most of our population we want to vote for us is in Portland, Salem, Eugene, and maybe Medford. So they really don't care about the people in Eastern Oregon. They don't care about the culture. They don't care about the unique challenges they have.
Is there more homeless people in Eastern Oregon than there is in the Northwest
If you look
area?
at per capita the population of Salem and Portland and Eugene, I would say no, but there is homelessness.
plenty of them.
And when
Yeah,
we
there's
were
lots.
there, we saw it literally out in the middle of nowhere because a lot of it is high desert, right? We would see an elderly lady. And of course, when you're out in the streets and you're homeless, you age faster, okay, from the weather and the elements. So
Having a
she
rough
was,
life. Yeah.
yeah, she was literally on the side of the highway with her tent just 1.5 feet from the freeway. Right there, very dangerous, okay? And we asked people in Eastern Oregon, they said, you would not believe the homelessness going on here in Eastern Oregon.
So why are they homeless? Do you know? Why
Part-
is it
part of it-
everywhere there's homeless, right? We got it in Portland. You got it in Eastern Oregon. We've got it everywhere. And you know, I mean, we drive around Portland. We see tent cities everywhere. You know, all these little camps
It's
and
horrible.
just full of garbage, and it's really unsightly. I mean, not knowing the people or anything that's in the camps, it's very unsightly. Obviously, those are real people in real situations, but why do we have so much homeless? What's the reason for it?
Well, part of it is the economy. The people don't want to talk about the deep state. The 1% who are the elitist that have the big money, who do not want us to rise above our stations because then they feel that we're not controllable enough. So what you have when you have inflation, you have the exuberant gas prices, you have the shortage of homes. What happens is a person, let's say they had a job and they were working that job, and this was a case of 3 people I know, 3 people in the last 2 years. They refused to take the jab. They refused to take what I call the inoculation. It's not a vaccination. It's an inoculation. It's an invasive procedure, that has not gone through the normal 5 to 7 year testing period that all medications have to go through before they're put out to the public or your doctor's office. So some of them said we lost our job because we would not take those experimental chemicals in our body. We saw people were dying from them, and that the news media was suppressing the actual information, that Facebook was censoring the information and saying it was disinformation, or shadow banning people who were trying to tell the truth of what happened to their family members that either were killed or were maimed, not by the COVID, but by the inoculations that came. So they ended up losing their jobs and living in their cars, and then eventually they couldn't afford their car registration. They were not getting enough money from food stamps, or maybe they weren't getting any money at all in the way of cash grants. And some of them, because they had no address to have their mail mailed to. If you don't have an address to send your mail to, then they won't give you the cash grant or the food stamps. So many of these people ended up homeless in the streets because of the economy, and also because of what they call it the plandemic, that this was planned. It's been in the planning for many years. As Bill Gates in his TED Talk said, we have to depopulate the world's population by 90% by the year 2030. That's 8 years from now, Roy. He said that we have to do it, and one of the things he listed to depopulate the world's population in his TED Talk, you can see it on YouTube, was by vaccines, okay? So some of these people are telling me that they're homeless because of that. Others are telling me that they've been homeless for many years because of either divorces or a death in the family, or just they lost everything on the stock market. They lost their savings due to some of the things that happened with our economy. That they say now, if us to be able to rent an apartment, you have to have first month's, last month's, and even a security deposit. Now, if your monthly rent is $1,500 a month, you're talking about now you have to come up with $3,000, and you have to come up with a security deposit that's maybe half of that. So we're talking about easily $4,000. Right. A lot of people don't have that in their savings. Some people are literally living from paycheck to paycheck. And when you lose your job, it very quickly puts you into poverty. And that's why we have the kind of homelessness. We have a shortage of housing. These 3 women running for governor against me have been in the legislature now. One of them, I think Betsy Johnson, has been in 27 years in the legislature as a Democrat. We have Tina Kotek that's been in the legislature. We've had Christine Drazen, who's been there since 2018, 2019. They had an opportunity to really deal with the homeless situation and deal with what was happening with the homelessness. And they did not. And now they're saying, give us 4 years as your governor and we will take care of the homeless situation. Where have you been for the last 4 to 27 years when the problem has been getting worse? Now, what happens with homelessness? I've been a psychiatric nurse, and before that a psychiatric technician for the better part of 47 years, starting in the military. I've been dealing with homeless veterans, men and women. People don't talk about the homeless women veterans. But let's talk about people who are homeless that have never even served in the military. When you're on the street and living almost in a survival mode, you become almost like, I don't want to say an animal type mentality, but almost like that. You come down to the very basic instincts of survival. And when you're living in the streets and you have other homeless people there that will roll you for whatever you have, there is no honor among thieves. You have to protect everything you have, even if it's just a basket full of a few belongings. You're going to find that mental illness goes up. There is a mental illness that will overtake you and can increase while you're living in the streets. Some of these people, they don't want to be like this, but they've learned where they can't feel like they can trust anyone. They go to a shelter, and the shelter has rules and regulations which need to be there in order to make sure everybody's safe who's in the shelter at night. But when the shelter says, in order for you to come to the shelter, you have to sit down and you have to go through a Bible class before we will give you a meal and give you a bed. Some of these people don't have a basic spiritual or religious upbringing, or have even been practicing it as adults. So now they feel they're being force-fed. In order to be able to get the food and get the shelter, they have to go through these religious classes or go through a service in the evening. You're told that if you want a bed in the shelter, you have to be in there between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening. Otherwise, the doors are locked and anybody else who needs a bed can't get in. Okay? Now you're in the shelter, and what few belongings you have, they may not have lockers where you can lock your belongings away safely. So you have to put them under your cot or under your bed. Well, we all know when we fall into a deep sleep, we're not necessarily going to wake up if somebody at 2 cots over is stealing what few possessions you actually own in the whole world. So they don't feel safe in these shelters. They don't feel like they're protected. And then another thing is, when you are in the shelter at night, if you were one of the lucky ones to get a bed, you're told you have to be out by 6 o'clock in the morning with everything you own, which isn't very much. What do you do with yourself from 6 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock at night when you might be lucky to get another bed in a shelter? So some of them have just decided it isn't worth it. Now, while they're in the streets, they're self-medicating with drugs and alcohol wherever they can get it. They're panhandling for money, and it's not always for drugs or alcohol. Many times they're panhandling for money to go to McDonald's and buy those Happy Meals, and those meals that used to be $5, $6 for a complete meal. And I don't mean the oversized meal, but now those meals are $9 and $10.
More, 15.
Or even 15. So these people here are now finding themselves in the streets trying to find a way to survive with the bare necessities, sometimes going days without anything to eat, okay? And so they're self-medicating, a way of numbing themselves down with whatever alcohol or drugs. And then we had the passage of Measure 110, which was basically legalizing the hard drugs like cocaine and heroin. So people need to go and really understand that when Measure 110 was put before us, they played with the words to make us think that it was going to mean one thing, and what it actually meant was something else, because they have a way of wording things where it sounds fuzzy-wuzzy and it sounds like a good thing, but it's a way to get us to vote and vote it in the way they want it to. Right. But actually it was very bad. Measure 110 passing here in Oregon actually harmed Oregonians. It caused more drug addictions, more mental illness, and it put more burdens on the justice system, including those police officers and those sheriffs that are already battling the mental illness, the homelessness in the street. And when you end up legalizing the hard drugs like heroin and cocaine, what's going to happen? You're going to have more crime. Crime has now gone up. And homelessness has even doubled now. And we're finding this even in Eastern Oregon. From what I understand, Kate Brown, our illustrious governor, she's making somewhere between $98,000 and $158,000 a year, plus benefits. Since she's been governor, she's amassed a wealth. And we know she's been working with the Red Chinese, as has Solomon Yu, who says he's a Republican. He was brought here and mentored by the head of the World Economic Forum. And Kate Brown now has, I understand, somewhere upwards of over $200 million that she's worth. $200 million. I can't even fathom that, okay? Wow. And so what she's done is she owns property up in Joseph, Oregon. She is right now taking some of the illegals that have come over the border and some of the people that have been brought from Afghanistan that are Afghanistani, and she is seeding them around Oregon. We're seeing that many people are illegally being flown from Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California, and they're being flown late at night after midnight on different chartered airlines, and they're being seated around the United States in small rural communities where the people really don't have a voice and they can't fight back. You can't fight City Hall. And we understand during my travels in Eastern Oregon that Kate Brown, who actually owns property above Joseph, there's a lake up there in the county of Wallowa, that she's actually seated some Afghanistan people in the town of Enterprise. She also went to Burns, which is in Harney County, and she's purchased a building there. Now she says, and the population of homeless in Harney County isn't that many, like you see in our populated counties here. But she says that this building is going to be for the homeless in Harney County. We're finding out through some of the grapevine that it looks like some of the illegals are going to be housed in this building that she's going to have made into apartments. And then she will be able to possibly get money from the federal government by subsidizing. Do you see where this is going? subsidizing and getting kickbacks from the federal government for housing some of these illegals that are seated in out of the way counties in small populated towns. To me, this is just more the pork and barrel. And this is what we see happening a lot with the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party has become captured for many years now. And we have some good Democrats out there that are angry by this. They see where the party they believed in has gone in a direction that they cannot support. And that's why we met some people in Washington, D.C. in November of 2020 when we were there to watch and observe. I'm a reporter, as you know. I am an investigative reporter and a researcher, and I write for numerous newspapers across the nation under the name of Maggie Rose, which is my radio name, and also my non-diplome. And I've also written under the name of Donice Jansen Smith. When I was back there with my husband JC and my son for the Stop the Steal in November, we actually went to a rally the next day that was called #Walkaway. And this is made up of people that were all formerly Democrats that have left the Democrat Party because they don't like where it's going. And we saw Tulsi, who's in Hawaii, who is a Democrat representative, and she's now left the Democrat Party and got up across the nation, around the world, and said, this is why I've left the Democrat Party. She's a beautiful woman out of Hawaii. She's a very caring woman. We have a lot of people that were formerly in the military that have served in the Senate and served in the Congress who are now saying we are also walking away from both the Democrat Party and we're walking away from the Republican Party. And that's why our Constitution Party is not what I call a minor party or a third party. I call it an alternative. You now have another choice. Instead of voting for the lesser of two or three evils, you can vote for someone who has integrity. And I think when she left the Democrat Party and the reason she gave why she did, I think she's a hero. I admire her greatly for that. I'm proud of her because she proved what Lavoy Finnegan told us. It matters how you stand.
Right. Yeah. Wow. So you were talking about the immigration there for a little bit, so we'll kind of transition into that. What are your thoughts on immigration? Just the whole thing.
Well, my mother at one time, she raised me to be a Republican. And when she ended up working as a full-time teacher in a junior college, she ended up becoming part of the teachers union. And the teachers unions have become what we call captured. Okay. Let me backtrack a minute to answer that so you'll understand where I'm going. Karl Marx one time said that we will not have to take over America with another war. We won't have to shoot or fire a shot. The Japanese admitted that to us in World War II, that the reason they didn't invade the United States and they tried to come in through Oregon, they're still finding remnants of where they tried to drop bombs along our beaches here in Oregon in World War II. A lot of people don't know that. As they said, because they knew there was a gun behind every blade of grass in America. Right. And what he said was that what we need to do is we need to take America over slowly, and we're patient, and we'll do it. It's like the frog in boiling water. You put the frog in a pot of water that's very lukewarm, and you let him sit there and he's relaxed and he's calm and he feels safe and secure. And then you slowly start to turn up the heat. And then right about the time he realizes the water's going to boil, you put the top on and you boil him to death. That's what they've been doing in this country for 130 years. It really started in 1871 when our country became corporations. It became a corporate state, a corporate slave state is what we call it. So what Karl Marx did was he set in place what we call the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. They don't teach this in middle school and high school or even in college most of the time. And what the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto is, you slowly take over the transportation system. You slowly take over the religious institutions. You slowly take over the banking system. And there's, like I said, 10 different things that they do. The transportation, the banking, the religious, and one of them happens to be the education system. So what they did about 100 years ago, roughly I want to say around 1920, is when they started teaching some of what we call the communist ideology. And they started teaching it in the colleges that were the teaching colleges, that were turning out our teachers that were going to teach elementary school, middle school, high school, and especially college. But they concentrated on those teachers that were going to be teaching junior college and university, and started basically a form of brainwashing, indoctrination. These are the teachers that would then go back and teach the junior colleges and the universities certain concepts that were basically the communist ideology, the Marxist viewpoints. And then it would slowly filter down over time. And so when my mother ended up becoming a full-time teacher in the 70s, she joined the teachers union. By that time, the teachers union had been compromised all across the nation. And what happens is when you end up compromising the education system, you end up teaching the younger people a certain way of thinking that does not encourage individualism. It does not encourage thinking outside the box. It does not encourage innovative ideas. You're told you have to think the way everybody else is thinking, and you have to stay within this perimeter. And it's sort of like, if you remember the story...
Like a sheep mentality?
Sheeple or lemmings. You know the story of the lemmings. If one lemming goes over the cliff, they all follow over the cliff. They don't even stop and think about the danger beneath the rocks down below. If you remember the story, we were raised about the Pied Piper. Do you remember that story, Roy? The Pied Piper was told by the townspeople that they were overridden with rats. And they had to do something because the rats were eating through and destroying everything. And they could not get rid of these rats and these mice. The rats were just they're very destructive. And so they begged the Pied Piper to please rid them of the rats. And he had this magical flute. And so he said, I'll do that for a price. I will rid your entire town of rats. And he did. And he led the rats away from town. And he took them to their death. Okay? When he came back for payment, the townspeople reneged. They weren't going to pay him like they had had a verbal contract with him that they were going to do. And so he said, okay. So he started playing. And he led the children away, all the children of the town. So you look at that story. You look at the story, The Emperor Has No Clothes. There's two stories I was raised as a child. The first one is, what do you do when you get 3 or 4 blind men who have never seen before? They've been sightless. And you bring them into a room with an elephant, and they have to tell you what is in that room. And so as they're feeling, one of them feels the leg of the elephant, and they feel, oh, this is like a trunk of a tree. And the other one feels, oh, well, this is a snake, the trunk of the elephant. Each person has their own perception depending upon what it is that is put in front of them. And then you have the story, The Emperor Has No Clothes. And I'm sitting here screaming and yelling, as many Oregonians are, the Emperor has no clothes. You need to open your eyes. But we're all being told, oh, but he is wearing clothes. So the story that I was raised on as a child, my mother was an English teacher, and she was a writer and author. She taught me how to write, is that the emperor came along and he told some of his people, you need to make me some beautiful clothes, and you need to spin it this way. And the truth is there was no thread to make clothes. But they knew that if they angered him, they were going to pay the price. So they pretended they were making him clothes, and they told him, these clothes are invisible, Emperor. We are making these beautiful clothes to your specification, and they're beautiful clothes, and we're just doing it. And he goes, but I can't see them. Oh, it's special thread. When people see you wearing them, they're going to see your clothes. So he put on these invisible clothes, which were really no clothes at all, and he was totally naked, butt-ass naked. And he decided to have a parade. And he went marching through the streets, and everybody was told, when you see the emperor come, you're to all scream and yell, your beautiful clothes, how handsome he looks, how beautiful he looks, because there was going to a price to pay if you didn't all clap your hands. It's what they do in communist China. You all have to clap that you approve of your leader. It's what Hitler had everybody doing. If you didn't clap and approve, you were put to death. In both communist China today, in North Korea today, and also in the days of Hitler. So the emperor is marching through the streets with no clothes on, totally naked. And one little boy, who's very innocent and didn't get the message, you have to pretend you see the clothes, he called out, but Mom, he has no clothes. Right now, Oregonians and people across the nation are being put into a mindset where they have to talk the talk and speak the speak, even though they know it's not true. They have to play along to get along. I won't be that kind of governor. I cannot be bought, and I won't play along to get along, and I will call it exactly as I see it. If the pot's black, we call it black. If the kettle's black, we call it black. If we see there's corruption going on within the Republican Party and within the Democrat Party, we're going to call them out.
Fair enough. That's great. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. And I understand you have a lot to say about federal overreach in the land management and in the roads too. What you probably have? That's probably a big one, huh?
Do you want to go with the land management or regarding our roads?
Well, start with. Let's start with the roads and then go into the land management.
Okay. First of all, I have to say that if you have traveled down to California, where some of us have family and friends down there who are not Oregonians like we are, you will notice that the highways and byways are littered with trash. They do a so-so job of picking up the trash along the highways and the byways, but the roads are poorly maintained and huge big potholes in the roads. It's very, very, I can't imagine a state like California would allow their roads to go in such disrepair that they do. I have to say in Oregon that I never see any trash on the highways. I don't know what it is that Oregon's doing that's right, unless what they're doing is they're having people that are serving their tickets that they got because they couldn't afford to pay their tickets in traffic court or whatever. But you will see all along the highways and byways of Oregon where if there is any trash at all, it's already been bagged up and it's getting ready for them to pick up the load of bags on the side of the freeway. The roads here are much better maintained than they are in some of the other states. But one of the things that I'm noticing is that our infrastructure, when it comes to our transportation system, is sorely lacking. You'll see the bus system in places like Portland and Salem and even Eugene and a little, not much in Medford. But we need a better transportation system. And if the liberal, the far left liberal, what they call themselves the progressives, let's be progressive then. To me, progressive means slowly more going towards socialism. And socialism, you have to have pure democracy in order to have socialism. No pure democracy has ever lasted more than 200 years. You can't have pure democracy and have it last. It usually becomes mobocracy, okay? So when people keep saying, we're a democracy, no, we're not. We are a republic. Right. And the Democrats like using that word democracy because it sounds like Democrat, right? Yeah. And so this country is not a democracy. It is a republic. Right. And just because democracy sounds a lot like Democrat doesn't mean it's fuzzy-wuzzy. Pure democracy is not long-lasting. Pure democracy becomes mobocracy, which becomes socialism. You have to have socialism, and you always will go from socialism into communism. Okay, it's a slippery slope. So what's happening with our infrastructure right now is that we need to have a better transportation system here. And my suggestion is, I have family and friends that live in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area, and they have something called the BART. That's B-A-R-T. It's the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, right. BART. And it is like the bullet trains you see in Japan. And they have now, over the space of the last 30 to 45 years, have got this train system that will go from Antioch, California to Fremont. You can change trains in Oakland or Fremont, and it can go on to San Francisco or Daly City. So if you're living in Antioch or Concord or Walnut Creek or Pleasant Hill, you can take the train that goes straight on to San Francisco to work, or straight on to Fremont to work, or straight on to Daly City. There is what they call a transfer station in San Francisco, and there's a transfer station, which is the MacArthur transfer station. It's a wonderful way. It gets people off the roads. It gets cars off the roads. This thing with us being forced to go to electric cars, it isn't going to work. Would you like to know, Roy, why it's not going to work?
Yes, I would like to know why. I think I know why, but I'd still like to hear it from you.
Well, I was listening to a radio station down in California, and they gave this story, which was very clear. First of all, when you have an electric car, you can't go that many miles without having to pull over and sit there for 2 or 3 hours and hook it up to an electric charging station, if you can find one, and more popping up, and pay to hook your electric car up, and you sit there. And JC and I were traveling across the state, and we came to this one place where in the parking lot there were 6 charging stations, and there was 4 cars with a couple, 2 people in each of the cars, sitting there talking on their cell phone, playing on their cell phone, not even talking to each other. People don't talk to each other anymore. They're on their phone. So they're not even interacting. And they're waiting for their cars to charge. Well, we went into dinner, came out 2.5 hours later, and the same cars were there still trying to charge up their vehicles. So I guess you can, some of these electric cars, you can, if you're lucky, go 100 miles without having to recharge again. I don't know.
They're getting better. They really are. I mean, they're close to 300 miles, and some even more than 300 miles, which is pretty amazing. A couple hundred miles on a charge will get most people to work and
But
back.
if you go 200 miles and you're going to go visit a family and it's 400 miles away, how many hours do you have to sit there?
Right. It doesn't seem like a practical car for your only vehicle, right?
No, it doesn't.
Maybe just for your commuter that you charge it while you're at work.
To and
at
from
home.
work, which brings me to that story.
Right. Go ahead. Keep going.
It brings me, you just brought it up. So here's the story I heard. Father, they're living in California, and he's driving an electric car. And he's tired, he's exhausted. And he has a meeting to go to that night. I don't know if it's a parent-teacher meeting. I don't know if he sits on the school board. I don't know what the meeting is, but it's after he comes home and he's going to have a shower and he's going to get dinner and then he's going to go to this meeting, right? Well, California is now having what they call these forced brownouts, where they will turn off your electricity and or they will tell people that there's a meter that they want to put, it's called a smart meter. Smart meters are bad, folks, here in Oregon. You don't want a smart meter. If you have one right now, you call up Pacific Power and say, I want it removed. I don't want a smart meter. I don't want to be tracked by Big Brother, okay? Just another tracking system. So Dad comes home from work and he plugs in his electric car and he goes in because he's going to take a shower and have a nice dinner before he goes to his meeting. And the family says, sorry, Dad, you have to unplug the electric car. You can't charge it. You can't go take a shower because all of our appliances are used by electricity now. Very few people have gas. Very few people have gas water heaters or gas stoves. So you can't take a shower because we can't use electricity to heat up the water. And you can't even use the stove, which is electric, to cook a meal. And you can't use the microwave because the microwave is using electricity. And we can't turn on the TV. So you sit there in the semi-darkness, can't take a shower, can't charge up your car to go to that meeting that you're supposed to be at. You can't have dinner, and you can't even sit there and watch TV and be entertained while you're waiting for this 3 to 4 hour forced brownout where you can't use electricity between the hours of 6 and 8 o'clock. So you're not going to get to go to your meeting, are you? So this is not very practical. And people are beginning to wake up and say, here's more Big Brother and control, when people like even AOC in Washington, D.C. says, well, cows, they emit a gas through their rear end. And a cowboy explained to me the way that the cows are made up, their autonomy, their anatomy, they don't expel gas. But she's running around in fancy cars and flying around in Lear jets while she's saying that cars and airplanes are polluting our atmosphere, but she's flying around in style. So it's very much like Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco and Kate Brown here in Oregon and Governor Newsom in California. The 2 women, Kate Brown and Nancy Pelosi, closed down all of our saloons and all of our restaurants during the pandemic, right? But they were secretly having their hair salons opened up for them. And Governor Newsom was closing down all the restaurants in California, but took 12 or 14 of his buddies, and they all went up to the French Laundry for dinner. And you know about the French Laundry in Napa County.
Yeah, that was all over the news.
It was all over the news. And they went in without a mask, and they came out without a mask. One person's dinner at the French Laundry is $300. Okay? So it's do as I say, but not as I do. The rules are for thee, but not for me. I, as your governor, would not allow that as your leader. So we need a train system that would go up and down the I-5 corridor, because I believe there's enough space in the median between the freeways, the northbound and the southbound lane, that we could get a bullet train that could go from Portland through Salem and all the way down to Medford. Why not? And why is it that we have a train system, the what we call Amtrak, that only will pick up people in Eugene and take them down south? We need a train system that will also stop off in places like Roseburg or, Canyonville and all the way down to Ashland. So we need to improve our train system, and we need to improve our...
It needs to be a safe train system for the passengers and people on board. I've heard some horrific stories about
safe.
About them being unsafe, people getting robbed, and stabbed, and all kinds of things happening.
We need cameras on those trains.
We
We need more cameras on the buses. We need more cameras on the trains, and the people that are driving around in buses as passengers in Portland and Salem and even Eugene. We need to know that that bus driver has some protection around him or herself, and that there's cameras there, and that there's training where if they see something going on in their bus, that there's an alert system that goes out, so that person that's committing the crime on the bus is apprehended. But the problem is we have these liberal Democrat DAs, many of them actually were put in place by George Soros and his shell companies, where George Soros has now these district attorneys that say, we're not going to prosecute. We're not going to force people to pay bonds. We're going to have them released as soon as they're arrested. What are we doing to our law enforcement, our police officers, where they're sitting there and they've apprehended someone that's committed a crime, and it takes them an hour to 2 hours to fill out a report, and before they're even halfway done filling out the report, the criminal's being released out the back door and never prosecuted and never has to come back to face charges. These law enforcement are being hogtied. They're being muzzled from being able to do their job. And when Christine Drazen played along to get along in the legislature and kept voting with the Democrats to play along to get along to defund the police, and now she's stating, you make me your governor and I'll make sure the police get what they need and no more defunding. Look what you did. When you voted the way you did, look at Portland. It burned. People died in Portland. Aaron, we know him as Jay, was basically murdered and surrounded by Antifa and Black Lives Matter, who pretend they were medical and they were not, because they wanted him to bleed out, and he did. And the police many times in Eugene and Salem are told to stand down. And they're standing down because they're being given orders to not move in when Antifa and Black Lives Matter are committing the crimes in our streets. People do not feel safe in Salem or Portland any longer to even walk the streets at 12 noon. People need to feel safe. And I, as your governor, would make sure that the law enforcement are supported and well funded, and that the mayors of those cities will pay the price if they do not allow their law enforcement to do the job that they're there to do. They took an oath. No different than the oath I took to the Constitution during the 35 years I served in the military. They are there to protect and serve. And we need to let them do their job. And we need to back them and support them.
For sure. Next question. Okay, so we were talking about the roads and the federal overreach, and we were going to get to the land management part of it.
That's a big problem here in Oregon.
Yeah.
Years ago, more than 20 years ago, we had such a wonderful income coming in from the logging. We had many mills that were able to mill the trees, to cut the trees, and then they would replant new trees. So in another 20 to 40 years, we'd have new forest growing up. And I had asked my son about 20 years ago if it would be possible for me to interview the grandfather of one of his classmates here in Oregon, in Douglas County actually. The man had been a logger, and he was like up in his 80s or early 90s by this time. And I said, please, I come from a family of loggers and farmers, not just, I had a grandfather who's a truck driver. I have a brother who right now is a truck driver. And my son now, in fact, it was the same son, it was his friend in high school. She invited me over to her grandfather's house, and my son now is a millwright, works for Roseburg Wood Products. And so she brought me over to see her grandfather, and he educated me what loggers do. They are truly the stewards of our land. They are the ones that actually clean out the slush and the underbrush to make sure that the forest floors are clean. And when they cut down a tree, he taught me they will sometimes plant 2 or 3 trees in the place of the one they cut down. And he told me stories of what happened to loggers when there was accidents. It is a very dangerous job these loggers have. And that's why I'm 200% behind the timber unity that I remember, the original timber unity that was founded by a couple people that I had met and I'd interviewed on my radio show. The original timber unity was one that was all about the stewards of the land and making sure the people in Oregon had a voice. And he taught me exactly what loggers do. And then I said, well, my great-grandfather was a logger. He was a head foreman of a logging company that worked both with Klamath Falls, Oregon, and also worked out in McLeod, California. He was the foreman of the big logging company in McLeod, California, which is next to Mount Shasta. What is happening is the federal government has come in, and it's almost like they act like it's by the right of eminent domain because they call themselves federal, that they can come into the state and they can either bribe us with money or they can say, we're not going to allow you to do this and not allow you to do this unless you allow this. And they've come in with their federal overreach, and they've taken over our natural resources. They're in control of most of our national parks like Crater Lake, and actually China now is in charge of Crater Lake. I don't know if you knew that. The communist Chinese actually have interest in Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Crater Lake. The average Oregonians do not know the part that communist China is playing in grabbing up our lands and taking control of our lands and taking control of some of the finances. But what the federal government has done with their Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Forestry is they've come in and say, we're going to maintain your high deserts here in Eastern Oregon. We're going to maintain your forest. But they are not doing it properly. They've many times done what we call burns, and they've allowed the burns to get away and destroy property, kill livestock. Fortunately, after what happened a few years ago to the Hammonds, when they tried to do a back burn because the department, federal government had allowed this burn to get out of control, the Hammonds did a back burn because when you have the two come together, the lack of oxygen extinguishes both of them, and this fire will no longer, that the federal government will no longer be able to destroy. But the Hammonds were set up. And the reason they were set up is because the government wanted to come in and take their ranch, because there's uranium deposits all around the Hammond Ranch that the EPA could not authorize that kind of uranium mining. But Hillary Clinton and Obama wanted to get rid of the Hammonds because they were one of the last ranchers standing, so they could find a way to get that uranium, because Hillary Clinton wanted that uranium here in Eastern Oregon. She was working with Uranium One, which is a company out of Canada, and she was working with the Russians. And so you had to get the uranium that was in our high desert. So what they've done is they've come in and they've prosecuted people for trying to defend their own property. But fortunately, we have a very brave sheriff who's up in Grant County. And he found out that one of the Department of Forestry employees did a burn, and the burn got away, and it destroyed acres and acres of land. So he went there and he arrested this federal employee, and it was all over the news. So finally now, people in the federal government who are being careless in their jobs, who are being callous in their jobs, are going to get prosecuted for the very thing that they've been trying to go after some of our ranchers and farmers who are just trying to protect their livelihoods. So we need to take back our own state. Right now they have over 60% of our lands under their control. We Oregonians can do a better job of taking care of our forest, maintaining our forest, doing the clear cutting, doing the replanting of trees. We need to let our loggers and our Oregonians be the stewards of our land again. It belongs to Oregon. It does not belong to the federal government. They are illegally violating the U.S. Constitution by taking command and control of these lands like they own them and putting them in their own name.
Okay. Wow. Hey, I've got another big question for you before we finish, and it's guns. It's weapons, guns. um, you know, things like that. What can be done aside from taking away people's guns? Obviously, I don't feel like we want to do that. That's not the right thing
We
to
can't.
do.
It's
And
not do we
can't.
want to, we can't.
We can't. So what can be done? You know, these school shootings, things that are going on, it's heartbreaking. It's horrible.
It is.
And man, nobody wants that to happen. And you know, there's a variety. I'm sure there's just some mental thing going on. We didn't, you know, used to have those kinds of things. It just seems to be in recent years that we've had school shootings. We didn't have school shootings in the 50s.
No.
You know, that was just
It was unheard of.
It was unheard of.
It was so few and far between and
Right.
so rare that it just.
Yeah.
And our law enforcement was allowed to do their job in the 50s and 60s and early 70s too.
Right. And, you know, so what can we do with guns? How can we manage and control, or should we manage and control, what can we do to try and minimize the negative effects of, you know, the guns getting into the wrong hands? Do you have any proposal on that?
Well, our population is a lot bigger than it was in the 50s, 60s, or 70s.
Absolutely.
I grew up in the late 50s and the 60s. My childhood was not idyllic. I grew up in a very difficult family, very dysfunctional, a lot of challenges. I came from a broken home. And, but I always knew that when I went to school, when I went to church, that I was safe. I didn't know what it was like to not be safe. I have great empathy right now, especially for the parents who've lost their loved ones here in Oregon. We had a shooting not very long ago up in Bend. I think it was at the Safeway store or something up there. And we also, and I want to share with you, so people understand that I am not, I'm not cold and callous about what they are going through and how they feel, but we need to make sure we don't do a knee-jerk reaction. So I grew up in a military where we had something called the M2K Ultra program, and learned a lot about that, where they were able to hypnotize people and get people to do things that normally they wouldn't do, okay? And we have a few alphabet soup agencies right now that we know we can't trust any longer. If you've seen the movie Air America, that was all about the CIA and what they were doing during the Vietnam War, okay? They have just stepped up that. They're doing that on a grander scale and they're getting away with it. We have some wonderful FBI employees. Some of them I know that their spiritual and religious family backgrounds is why many of them are selected to go in the FBI. But some of them want to get that 30-year retirement, and so they play along to get along. And then we have others that are whistleblowers that say we can't be part of this alphabet soup agency if it's doing this, okay? So let me tell you the story of what happened a few years ago in Roseburg in Douglas County that had to do with the gun. We have a young man, and we don't know, I don't know the details. He could have been very similar to the case that happened in Columbine. If you remember, there was 2 young men there that were shooting up the school. And one of them might have been, I think he'd been a military dependent at one point. And when you're in the military, many times the parents that are in the military, and they take their children to the base doctor or mental health, you're not going to always know what's going on with the sessions between your child and mental health. And sometimes some very nefarious things happen within the system because they are basically breeding young people for something in the future. Sort of like what we call the Manchurian Candidate. If you know anything about the Manchurian Candidate, there's a movie. Also, there was a story with Mel Gibson where he himself had basically been trained and was not aware that he'd been trained to do certain things, and then to forget what he was trained to do, okay? The shooting that took place was in Roseburg. It was at Umpqua Community College. My husband, JC, and I had both gone back to school in our 50s as what you call non-traditional students. to go back and get some more college degrees, to get some more college education. I already had my nursing a degree and diploma and license, and I had an associate's degree that was over 10 years old, so they said it was outdated. So I had to go back to school again. And I received an Associate of Science and an AAOT, both from Umpqua Community College. So that gave me 3 associate's degrees, not including my nursing. And I had a son that also went to Umpqua Community College. Actually, all 3 of my younger boys did. And one of the teachers that my one son and I had was an English teacher there. And he had a class that started, it was the semester beginning. And I don't know what happened. The class was taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Something happened in the Tuesday class, which was the first day of class. Something was said, something happened, and it triggered one of his students. This student had come up from Southern California. His father and mother were of 2 different cultures. They were divorced. And I don't know if he was on medications or was suddenly taken off the medications. Maybe his mother was not aware that somebody took him off suddenly. But he went off. And on Thursday, when he showed up at class, which was the second day of the semester, he immediately shot the teacher in the head and killed him. And he started shooting. And then he told all the students to hit the ground. And he went from student to student and saying, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" And some of them said yes. Some of them, I don't know what they said. But the ones I know of that said, "Yes, we do," he would say, "Well, you're going to join him right now." And he shot him. And he killed him. A gal that I knew a little bit, she was kind of a casual acquaintance friend of mine, was in the classroom next door, which was the computer room. And she heard the gunfire going off. And she left the computer room and she came, from what I understand, down the hallway and started to put her hand on the door of the classroom, and he shot her through the door. And she, I think, stumbled back to the computer room and she bled out and died in her friend's arms. There was another young man that was there. I think he had military background. And he was shot like 6, 7, 8 times and he survived because he was trying to stop the gunman. And eventually we're told that the gunman committed suicide and shot and killed himself. This was a shock that went throughout all of Douglas County. And at the time that it was happening, my husband and I had just finished my radio show. I was actually doing my radio show in front of the library, the Douglas County Library. And my husband had said to me, "Well, let's meet at Elmer's and get something to eat." So we were literally getting ready to go get breakfast, and we saw sirens going down the I-5 heading north towards Umpqua Community College. So we went there, and the command center was set up there in the fire station. There's the state troopers are right there, and there's the fire station. And we set up the command center, and our sheriff at the time, John Hanlon, took control of the situation. And all I can say is the shock from that is still going through the community.
Right.
But it's not the gun that does it, or we call it in the military. We used to have to be dropped for push-ups. If we called it a gun, it had to be called a weapon. But the gun is not what does it, it's the person behind it. And I believe that we already have so many rules and regulations in place to try to make sure that the guns don't fall in the hands of the wrong people. And every once in a while, someone will slip between the cracks, and I know that. But we cannot keep on adding more gun policies and more gun rules that all it's going to do is punish those of us that are law-abiding citizens. We should have the right to protect ourselves. Guns aren't just for hunting or target practicing or competition. We should be able to have a handgun. And if you have that handgun, you should not have it locked in a safe with a gun lock thing in it. So if someone's coming through your window, by the time you get there to try to unlock the safe in the darkness where you could barely see, you're being roused out of a 2 o'clock in the morning sleep. You're not all there. So you're not going to necessarily be able to open up the gun safe properly the first time, right? And then even if you get your gun out and you have to then unlock that with a special, that person's already on top of you. That person's already either rounding up your family and telling you, "I'm going to do this to your wife or your children if you don't conform to what I want you to do." So your life is in danger by having your guns locked away in a safe with special locks put on them. Then what is the sense of having it to protect yourself? There has to be a system where people can have their firearms ready.
Fingerprint readers on your, I mean, if You touch it, it knows who you are. Someone else tries to take your gun. It doesn't work for that.
Right.
You know?
Because you're going to find that mace and pepper spray doesn't always work. And let me tell you, as a nurse, if you have a gentleman hopped up on heroin or cocaine, because now we've made it legal, right, under Measure 110.
Yeah.
So if they're hopped up on heroin or cocaine, but especially if they're hopped up on methamphetamines, I have seen people as a nurse who are hopped up on meth, and they would literally run off of a roof 2 stories up, is what our police officers have told us. Downtown Salem, downtown Portland, they run off the roof and they end up jumping to the ground, even breaking the bones in their legs, and they still keep coming at you.
Angel dust, right?
So yeah, because it is something about the meth. They don't feel the pain. They don't know they've broken their legs, and they're just coming at you. So if you've got someone on meth who's come through your window or cut through your screen door, and they're coming after you and your family members, and your house is semi-dark or all the way dark, you're not going to be able to stop them with mace or pepper spray. Mace and pepper spray will absolutely do nothing. If you spray it directly in their face from 2 feet away, it will not stop a meth head. It will not. So again, I hate to think about having to shoot someone in the center of mass to protect yourself, but if it's them or me, I'm afraid it's going to have to be them. And so my advice to people, if you have a handgun or you have a firearms in your home and you have to defend your life and the lives of your family members, make sure that as soon as it takes place, you make sure that you call 911 and you make sure that your handgun is placed away from you, and you lie down on the ground and you wait for the police to arrive, because they can't come in until they know they're safe. And if you're still standing there holding that gun, they're not going to know that you're not the perk or the criminal, right? So if you have to defend yourself, you put the gun away from your body and far enough away from the person, because you don't know if they're unconscious or you've completely taken them out. And you make sure that you let the police know that you will be there waiting for them. And you lie down and you either put your hands behind your head or you put your hands underneath you and you wait for the police to arrive, and then you just comply with whatever they say. Okay? And eventually they'll be able to see what the crime scene was and that you were trying to defend yourself, your life, or your family. Okay? So I believe handguns should not be taken out of law-abiding citizens. I believe that we put any more rules, we're violating the Second Amendment already as it is, okay? The Second Amendment was put there for another reason, for self-defense against a tyrannical government. If you don't think that America could not go the way of Venezuela or the way of Australia, okay, Hitler rounded up all the guns, and then it was easy to round up all the people and put them in the big city, and then in the middle of the night have the SS take them away. In Venezuela, they took away all the guns in 2012. By 2019, Venezuela, which was even more prosperous in many ways than the United States, has now fallen into worse than a third world country. And they are starving to death in Venezuela. So in Australia, they took away all the firearms in Australia. The elderly people were reporting to me when I was doing my international radio show called The Concord Show that they could not even feel safe to walk the streets at 12 noon through Australia because crime had gone up by 300%. And it was very easy for the Australian government to round up people 2 years ago and take their kids into places where they were forcing the jabs on them. And children were dying in these processing centers. And the parents were told to stay outside while the kids were being given the jab. And then to find out later their children had died in the facility while they were being given the jab, or they died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And the parents are still sitting out there for 2 or 3 hours wondering, well, Joey, he went in that door with the Australian military or the Australian law enforcement, but didn't come out the back way 3 hours later. Okay, so we already know that what happens when your guns are taken away. Australians who refused to take the jab were rounded up and put in makeshift concentration camps in Australia. So our Second Amendment is there to protect us from a tyrannical government. It is our Second Amendment that protects our First Amendment. What is our First Amendment, Roy? What does it contain?
Freedom of speech.
What else? Freedom of speech, what else? freedom of religion, or to not practice a religion if we don't want to. Do we want a one world religion forced on us, like the Catholic Church and the New World Order and the deep state are saying they're going to force on us a one world religion? So the Second Amendment protects our First Amendment of right of free speech, right of the free press, right not to be censored like in Facebook, not to be shadow banned, right of religion, okay? We have these rights. The fifth one is, okay, so freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We also have the freedom to address our government for grievances. We should have the right to peacefully assemble, peacefully protest, not be put in a 6 foot by 4 foot space with ribbon around and said, you can do your free speech protesting right here, but far away where the public can't see you and hear you protesting. That's not what free speech is all about. So the Second Amendment protects our First Amendment rights, and there's 4 or 5 of them, and also protects our Fourth Amendment and our Sixth Amendment. Our Fourth Amendment is we should feel safe in our homes, our possessions, which includes your car. Look what they did to President Trump. They broke in his home in Mar-a-Lago. They even tried to plant evidence on him while he was in New York. Okay? So his Fourth Amendment and his Sixth Amendments were both violated, right? And if you have something in your car, we've known that police officers that were corrupt have done something and they have planted evidence on people in their car. So the First Amendment and the Fourth and Sixth are both supposed to be protected by the Second Amendment. And also we have to talk about education real quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's talk about education.
Here we go. So, your beautiful wife she's a foster mother, she's a mother herself, and she's dealt with the education of young people that have disabilities, who have IEPs, which are called individual educational plans that are set up between the parents and the teachers and the school district for those kids that are having troubles with either autism, Asperger's, attention deficit disorder, ADD, ADHA, okay? But what is happening is that the educational system, the public schools we call it, the federally funded public schools, are pushing children through the system. For every child that sits in a classroom, there's so many thousands of dollars that the state gets and that the school gets for having that child there. If the child stays home from school one day sick, the school is not going to get the money for that one day, right? So a lot of times they're encouraging children come to school sick, which means that they get everybody else in the school sick, and it's just going round robin like that, right? I have a child that was learning disabled, and he's now 29 years old. And he was pushed through the system. We started off in a public school, they weren't helping him. We then put him in homeschooling for a while, and then we ended up private schooling him, and then he went back to public school. And what they would do is they would teach down to these students, and they would not try to work with them in such a way where they were really completely successful, and they pushed them through the system. And so by the time they graduate with a modified diploma or a diploma, they're coming out without the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, because they were pushing them through just enough to get those federal dollars and do the bare minimum that they needed to do in order to be able to get them to so-called pass, even many times saying, we're not going to do any standardized testing. Now, Kate Brown just came down recently and said, you know, I am going to reduce the requirements to graduate high school here in Oregon. We're no longer going to ask the students to have standardized testing, and we're going to cut out some of the requirements to graduate high school, whether it's in the math or the Englishes or the sciences. And her reasoning was, well, what's happening here in Oregon is, now this was before she did this, we were already number 45 and 46 education-wise out of 50 states in the union before she did this. That's pretty bad, number 45 and 46 out of 50, okay? So she said what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the education standards, and we're going to not make the same requirements to graduate high school. And it's because our Latino children and our black children, especially in the inner cities, in the urban areas, and our indigenous children can't meet those standards. So to me, that was a racist comment. That is racist in itself.
Right, yeah.
Okay? When you're saying that your black children, you're Latino, Hispanic, and you're indigenous
Don't
cannot
have
meet those
what it
standards.
takes. You're saying they don't have what it takes to,
Exactly. And I disagree.
right.
I totally disagree. The Democrat Party started off after the Civil War being the KKK. That's how the Democrat Party is older than the Republican Party. The Republican Party didn't come along until after the Civil War. Okay? So the Democrat Party was the racist party. They were the ones that started the KKK. They're the ones that didn't want to allow the blacks to vote after the Civil War when the blacks were told they had the right to vote. Blacks that were trying to vote after the Civil War were being hung by people like the KKK. When the Democrat Party in the 20s and 30s, they were the ones pushing for segregation, where you had to have black colleges and white colleges. And I was actually the nurse for Dr. Oberholzer. His name was Kenneth Oberholzer. When I was stationed in the military in California, I had a part-time job at night working for a registry. And he was superintendent of schools in Long Beach, California, in Texas, in Denver, Colorado. And he said to me that his father had founded the Houston University in Texas. And that back in the days he founded it, in the 20s and 30s, he had to do a black college across the street because whites were not allowed to go to Houston University. So you had Houston for all whites, and you had the black college for all blacks, okay? So the Democrat Party is the one that pushed for that. They were the racist party for segregation in the 20s and 30s. Back in the 90s, I was invited to be part of a movie. I helped make movies myself. I was in a few little movies here and there. And the movie I was an extra in was with Gary Sinise, who played Lieutenant Dan on Forrest Gump. Remember Lieutenant Dan?
Yeah. Who
lost his legs in Vietnam and Forrest Gump saved his life. Well, Gary Sinise is a wonderful man and a wonderful actor. And we were making a movie in Sacramento. They would not allow the movie to be filmed in Alabama in the 90s because they still have issues regarding segregation and civil rights in the South. And so we made this movie in Sacramento, California, and it was made using the Sacramento State Capitol as if it was a legislature in Alabama. And Gary Sinise played the part of George Wallace, the real governor of Alabama in the 60s. And originally he was against segregation. He believed that we shouldn't have segregation. But if he wanted to get voted as governor, he had to pretend that he believed in segregation. So he switched his platform. And I was one of those Southern belles that was all for him becoming governor, and I was supposed to pretend that I was for segregation. And so I'm in a part of the film where he's coming in to speak to the legislature of Alabama, and 3 of us women were put up in the catwalk, and we were screaming segregation, 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 which I'm totally against. JC's and my maid of honor was Black American. She was the sergeant major in our Army Reserve Unit. 2 of my bridesmaids were Black American. They were in our Army Reserve Unit as personnel clerks. So we don't see skin color in the military. So what we're finding happening in the education system here in Oregon is the dumbing down. If you sit there and you take away the standards because you say these people cannot meet the standards, instead of giving them handouts, we need to give them help-ups. Instead of dumbing down all of our education standards, which is dumbing down our Caucasian children in Oregon as well, is basically what you're doing is racist, and it's harming the rest of the majority of our children here in Oregon. We can't have that. We need to bring our standards back up again. We need to teach the children how, instead of saying, okay, you can reach for here to be successful, no, you are capable of reaching out here to be successful. Okay, and in our educational, individualized education plans for kids that are having learning disabilities, whether it's autism, Asperger's, or coming under that umbrella of having a little bit of each of those learning disabilities, you need to be able to let these people know you are capable of being anything that you want to be. Don't let someone define who you are because of a test score or because you got a C instead of an A or B. You are capable of doing and being anything you want to be. We need teachers out there that really want to teach and not just to collect a paycheck. And many of those teachers now will not give homework, and they use the excuses, well, if I give out homework, only some of my kids will bring it back, and will I be able to correct it? But most of the teachers are being honest and saying, we don't want to give homework anymore. And homework was basically that you and I, Roy, were sent home with homework because it would reinforce that night what we learned that day. It would more firmly implant what our teacher, our reading teacher, science teacher, math teacher taught us. It would firmly implant that. So later on, they're not testing to teach. They're teaching for us to be able to retain and not just regurgitate. So what you do in the educational system, these teachers are saying, I don't want to give homework because it means I have to go home at night and correct those papers. And no one's paying me after 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go home after my dinner hour and correct papers till 9, 10, or 11 o'clock at night. I grew up with a mother who was correcting papers until midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. My son, who's 45 and teaches 6th, 7th, and 8th grade public school, he gives out homework. And he will go home after his 3 daughters are in bed, and he will correct papers before he goes to bed. So no, you think you're not getting paid after 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go home and correct papers. You have a salary that you're being given in benefits. And you need to work around that. But there are some good teachers. Teachers who know that they're not getting enough money because our logging's been taken away from us, our federal resources, our natural resources are being sent out offshore, and they're being processed and then brought back, and we're being charged for our own resources double the price. We're not getting the money from our natural resources, from the logging that we used to get, to pay for the textbooks so the kids could go home with textbooks. Teachers are having to dip, some of the good ones are dipping into their own paychecks to pay for school supplies so their children will have the school supplies they need in the classroom. So our educational system needs complete revamping. And we need teachers that are really there to teach, not just there to be able at the end of the day have a PERS system and get a retirement where they're making more money in retire status than they were as teachers. So I'm not saying throw out the PERS system. I'm saying the PERS system needs to be completely revamped. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But for teachers who have been making this paycheck for 10, 20, 30 years, and now retired, they're making more than they did when they were working. Boy, I wish I had a job like that. And that's why Oregon's also in trouble financially right now, because our PERS system is completely off kilter. So our entire education system, Roy, needs to be a complete overhaul. We are now number 46 or 47 out of 50 states in the union. That is what I call piss poor. And we should be ashamed as Oregonians that we have allowed the Salem legislature, people like Drazen and Kotek and Johnson, who's been there for over 20 years, and 40 years, 30 to 40 years of Democrat rule in the governor's office to put our state in the sad state that it's in right now.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We really need to redo our whole education system and bring our students up, not just give them a participation award and let them, get out there and not have a job. They'll end up being homeless on the side of the road. It'll all come to
these kids should not feel, Roy. Right. They should not feel they have to go to college if they don't want to. Many of these kids say, I don't want to go to junior college or university and have $30, $40, $50,000 in debt, and I spend my lifetime paying off. They might want to go to a trade school.
Exactly.
So why can't we prepare them? Why can't we teach them when they graduate high school how to follow basic instructions, like at the top of your paper, put your last name first, then your first name with a comma, and put the teacher's name below it, and then the class name right below that. They don't even know how to follow basic instructions. They don't know. Roy, I'm so frustrated. I was actually brought into Umpqua Community College while I was going back as a non-traditional student to be a tutor. I was paid a part-time wage, 7-something an hour, to tutor students that were struggling with their English reading and writing at a junior college level. Some of them had just come out of high school. Some were coming back to school as non-traditional older students, and they were coming in with D's and F's on their papers. And I would sit there to tutor them and watch other English reading writing tutors say, okay, this is how you correct it. And they would correct the paper for them, say, now go back and rewrite it and turn it in. That's not teaching that student the mistakes they made. They were making comma splices. They were using run-on sentences. Their sentence structure was incorrect, and they weren't even having complete paragraphs, right? What I did with my students is I said, okay, I want you to read your paper, your essay to me out loud, and hear your voice, how you're reading it. Does that even sound? Oh no, my sentence was a run-on sentence, and I didn't put a comma splice. I had a sentence that had 3 different thoughts in it, but I didn't separate it with a comma. So I would have them learn and actually teach themselves out loud with me there what mistakes they made. And I said, now you correct those mistakes in front of me and let's do it again. Once they corrected their own mistakes, do you think they would ever make that mistake again on another essay? No. Me there correcting the papers and correcting all their mistakes and then telling them just go back and rewrite it and turn it in like it was your work. I'm not teaching them anything. But having them there learn what their mistakes are with me there guiding them and saying, oh, did you miss something there? Look it, is that not, what's that called? Oh, my teacher would call that a comma splice or call that a run-on sentence. Okay, correct it. Now let's read it out loud together again. Now go back and rewrite it and turn it in. Those students were coming back to me with their next essays and they'd gotten A's and B's. In fact, one girl was so good, and she was much younger than me, that she got my job the next semester. That's how good I was. I brought her from F's up to A's, and she was the next one hired to be an English reading writing tutor there at Umpqua Community College. So I consider that a job well done. We need to actually let people know that our students are capable of doing this. We should no longer be number 46 or 47 out of 50. And we need people like your wife who are working with young people that have learning disabilities and are struggling to know that they can succeed. We just have to find out where their talent is. This person's talent or abilities may not be the same as another one's. Every child is special. Every child is unique. And we need to remind ourselves of that before we can remind them of that.
Right, yeah. For sure, absolutely. Is there anything else? Did we leave off any important subjects here?
Well, I think that the most important thing right now that people are telling me, they're very angry because our election system has become here in Oregon. This is a state, they call it, it's a selection. We spell it S-E-L-E-C-T-I-O-N, a selection state instead of an election state. The mail-in voting and the ballots is catering to people that are lazy or forgetful or apathetic. We can't have that anymore. We're finding all across the nation now that they're beginning to realize the mail-in balloting is fraught with fraud. And in fact, in Europe, they actually tried years ago before we did to do the mail-in balloting. And they're doing away with it in Europe because they're finding out that there's no good checks and balance system to make sure there isn't.
There's no way to validate it.
There's no way to validate, and there's too much corruption going on. So 3 things that we need to deal with here. The first thing we need to deal with is all college students and university students who have come to go to school here in Oregon, whether they came from Kansas or Texas because they like what we have offering here, or whether they came from Germany or Korea. When you come from out of state, you pay double the tuition. When you come from another country, you may even pay more out of state tuition. Wow. So they come here, and because of the Democrats pushing the voter-motor law, okay, that means that they are able to go and get their driver's license. Because if you're going to be a college student, let's say at U of O or Corvallis, you're going to need to drive sometimes, and you should have the right to have a driver's license. But what's happening is when they go down and get their driver's license, the Department of Motor Vehicle of Oregon is primarily run by the Democrats. Most of them in there are Democrats and very liberal. And they're going to have on the bottom of the paper, they used to have, it would say, are you registered to vote? And some of these students would say, no, I'm not registered to vote. Well, would you like to register? Well, sure. Some of these people are from outside the country and they're not naturalized citizens. They're not American citizens. They're not even naturalized. They should not have the right to vote. So they should have the right to have a driver's license, but they should not have the right to vote and get a ballot. And what's happening is they're having ballots mailed to them. And some of these students are telling us they got 2, 3, or 4 ballots in the mail. And they thought, okay, we're going to do things the way the Democrats want us to do. So they would go ahead and illegally vote and send it in, and it's counted. Now, that's totally illegal. We agree, right? Totally illegal. Now, we also have students who came here from Kansas, and they are legally here to be students, but their ballots are being mailed to their parents' house in Kansas. And the parents will mail them sometimes they're ballots to Oregon to fill out and then send back to the parents. But the student went and got their driver's license in downtown Salem. And so because of that, now they're getting a ballot sent to them in the mail, even though they're an out-of-state resident. They are a legal citizen of America, but they are not a legal resident of Oregon. They're filling out these ballots.
And turning it in.
And turning it in.
And there's no checks
No.
of any kind to
No.
say, no, this person isn't even a Oregon.
And the Democrats like this because most of the students have been indoctrinated in our public universities and colleges to think the way of the liberals, to think the way of the progressives or the Marxists, okay? And most of the teachers there and my mother was one of those. She was guilty of influencing her students in her critical thinking class and her English class to think only this one way. And all the materials she would give them to study was geared towards having them think the way she thought. And that's just human nature. Some teachers, it's their human nature. But there's another problem too. Now these students have graduated with their 4-year degree. They go back to Korea, they go back to Germany, they go back to Texas, they go back to Kansas. Guess who's still voting 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later? Those same students that are back in their home countries or their home states, even though they've never stepped foot back in Oregon again, and they're not residents of Oregon, somebody is still voting for them. We need to clean up our rolls.
Somebody's filling them out, huh?
That's the first problem. Number 2 problem. People are actually going around and going through obituaries, and they're going through cemeteries, and they're actually filling in ballots ahead of time and putting those people's names on the ballots. There's another problem. I'm speaking as a nurse now. I've worked in nursing homes, convalescent hospitals. You have a lot of people there that have Alzheimer's or dementia. With Alzheimer's, it's much different from dementia. Alzheimer's, you reach a point where you don't know your name, you don't recognize your children or grandchildren come to visit you, you don't know the day or the year or anything. You're just like a vegetable, okay? You have staff members, many of them that are progressive, liberal, Democrats, that will sit there and fill out the ballots for them and turn them in their name. There has to be a checks and balances in the assisted care facilities, the convalescent hospitals, to make sure this doesn't happen. Because you're going to have people be dishonest everywhere. And if you give them away, they're going to do it. If you give them an inch, they're going to take an acre, okay? So we have a lot of convalescent hospitals, a lot of assisted care facilities that are doing this. Not all of them, but a majority of them, this is happening. It's wrought with fraud. So we need to take care of that. So what we need to do is go back to where the only mail-in ballots will be if you're military stationed overseas or out of the state, or if you have such medical conditions that you can have verified to your elections clerk and your Secretary of State. Therefore, those ballots are the only ones that should be mail-in. We need to get back to one person voting in person on election day, one day to vote, election day. Now, I would make it a legal holiday.
That was my next question.
It would be, to me, it's a legal holiday with pay.
I work.
Yeah.
All of us work, and so we
By the time you get off work at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock, the polls close at 8 o'clock, right? You may not be able to get down there.
Yeah.
So I want it to be election day is a legal holiday, okay? For those people that absolutely cannot make it to the polls on the 8th, they should be given the opportunity to go in person on the 7th, okay? You should have your ID showing you're an American citizen and you're an Oregonian resident. And we have to do something about these college students that are voting illegally, okay? That are not American or naturalized citizens or Oregonian residents. So one person with verified ID or voter ID, maybe a special ID card that says I am legally able to vote. Your name better be on a piece of paper when you walk into that school auditorium or that church auditorium and have your name there like we did in the olden days. You would walk in with your ID, they would look you up, yes, you're registered to vote for this election, they mark you off, they hand you a ballot, you walk in and you have a little tiny desk with a little screen around it, you pull the curtain, you fill out your ballot, okay, and you do it properly, and you come back and you hand it to a person, and she's got 6 other people sitting at the table, and it goes into that box and it's sealed, okay? One person with proper ID on one day, okay? So one person, one ballot, one vote. That's the way it should be. The Democrats in Oregon recently have passed in the legislature to give our elections clerks, and many of them are Democrats, or they're being, you say, compromised with county commissioners and others that are Democrats who say they're nonpartisan, to then have the discretion, according to Ms. Fagan, who's the Secretary of State, to be able to extend the election from the 8th of November to the 10th, to the 13th, to the 15th, even beyond that. And saying, well, look, if people are mailing in their ballots and they mail them properly on the 4th or 5th, the post office has to stamp it, right? It needs to be stamped by the 8th. Well, now people like our county clerk was telling us that he's being allowed, because of the Democrat-controlled majority in Salem, he's being told you can accept ballots with no postmark stamp on them, which means anybody can hand it to him or he can receive it on the 12th, 13th, and 14th. So we're telling people that this has got to change. We're going to have to change what the legislature did. And another thing we're telling people to kind of circumvent that, those of you that have already mailed out your ballots, I'm sorry, because that's actually giving them a chance to still commit fraud. We're telling our people to vote no earlier than the 7th and no later than the 8th, and do it in person. Find a way to go down on the 7th and say to your county elections clerk, I want to vote my ballot right here in your office, and turn it in to you here, or put it in that little box. Okay? And so we're saying if you turn it in on the 7th or the 8th, preferably the 8th before 8 o'clock at night, they have less chance to know how the ballots and the voting is going to go. Because when they know 2 weeks before the 8th, like they're learning right now how it's going.
Then they know how many false votes they need to bring in to. How
many ballots that they're going to harvest with fake ballots that were pre-filled out. Now, there's a lady by the name of Lisa Michaels, and she lived here in Oregon. She was a talk show host. She ran for office, I think, Congress up in the Portland area. And she was warning us back in 2009 to 2012. She put out documentaries on how they're doing this. And she was warning Oregonians how they were actually doing this. And now there's a movie called 2,000 Mules that just came out.
Actually.
Dinesh D'Souza. He's made Hillary's America, Obama's America, numerous movies warning us about how we're losing America and how we're going into decline. Dinesh D'Souza showed us in 2,000 Mules exactly how it was done. Actual live video with secret cameras that were set up.
Yeah. What I don't get is, I know that it's been censored or
they're poo-pooing the whole thing.
Yeah, it's like
that's all fake. It's all fake. That's not happening.
The mainstream media like Fox and Newsmax, and they won't even talk about it.
No.
But I saw it, and it looks like legit evidence from.
Do you know why, Roy? Do you know why they're not talking?
True the Vote, right? The organization that takes captures all that data from the cell phones, and it shows the unique ID of each cell phone, exactly pinpoint their location, to the inch, pretty much. And it showed all those people going to multiple booths multiple times within a day, and then they got the video showing these same people stuffing hundreds of ballots in the boxes. And
we saw it.
Right.
A picture tells 1,000 words.
So why is there not more attention to this? I mean, it's crazy that well, Fox News is supposed to be your friend. They're supposed to be, on the right side of things.
We thought. But what happened is the man who owned Fox News, his children took it over. And his children are the liberal progressives. So Fox News has been changing because of that. And the thing is, if you look at, in order to have Fox News, in order to have ABC and CBS and CNN, you have to be licensed, right, through the FCC. Okay, so there is something called the deep state, and it's through a group that's calls itself. We have what they call BlackRock. We have Vanguard. Okay, so Vanguard, BlackRock, George Soros, Bill Gates, and a place called Knight Rider. Knight Rider has spent the last 30 plus years basically taking control of all the news media, the newspapers across the U.S., the TV channels, as many radio stations as they can grab. Knight Rider is the one that is steering things going progressively to the left, to the Marxist, to the communist, socialistic way that we've been going. So you look at Knight Rider, okay? Knight Rider is very responsible now for who gets licensed if they're good little boys and girls. If they want to continue to have a business, Fox News, CNN, ABC, CBS, MNBC, which used to be NBC, it's now not NBC, it's now MSNBC. Very, very, very liberal, almost over the cliff, okay? Both them and CNN. They will make up stories, and I, as a journalist, as a professional journalist for 47 years, actually, if you count my high school, 49 years as a journalist, okay? They don't teach journalism in the schools anymore how to be fair, objective reporting. They want you to report even lies if it's going to bring in ratings and sensationalism, okay? So why Fox News is not showing the truth? Why are these others? Because it's all about money and the big bucks and to keep Knight Rider happy, to keep BlackRock happy, to keep Vanguard happy, keep George Soros and Bill Gates and the deep state. Most of the people controlling our country don't even live on our shores. Most of the monopoly and the big, huge, deep state live in England. They live in the Vatican, they live in Spain, they live in Germany, they live in other countries, and yet they're controlling us, and they have been since they turned us into a corporation in 1871. Our Constitution went away in 1871. So they are controlling. The only good news that I see is Newsmax and One American News. One American News is the most patriotic, and I mean this, the most legitimate, fair, objective reporting. I used to even watch Al Jazeera. Did you ever see Al Jazeera? It was basically overseas. There were some news channels that were coming out of Russia called RT, and we had Americans here that were reporting news for this Russian RT. But the one that is the truly American patriotic is Newsmax and One American News, or what we call OAN. We need to get back to fair, balanced, objective reporting. That's what Laura Logan is doing. Laura Logan is a friend of mine who lives in Texas, and she was actually a reporter with one of those agencies over in the Sandbox. Oh, we have little ones here. Yes, Laura Logan, is going all over the country now warning Americans that we need to start at a grassroots level. Hi, kiddo. At a grassroots level. And we need to take back our country at a local level. And we need to start here in our townships and our counties. We can't worry about what's going on in Washington, D.C. anymore. I love children. So, does he want to come over and sit with me?
No, I think he wants to play with the recording equipment.
Oh, okay. Well, this is very impromptu, and we're a big family here, so this is cool. So anyway, that's to wrap it up, is what we need to do is get back to fair and balanced reporting, and we need to make sure that the kids coming out of journalism school are basically being taught to do fair, objective reporting. And we're not seeing that anymore. We're seeing where we have to have people go and put cameras under the tables and record Planned Parenthood admitting that they are aborting babies so they can sell them for baby parts, okay? We have to be able to have people like, what's his name, James O'Keefe with Project Veritas. I met these people.
And it's sad that we'd have to resort to that.
Why does Project Veritas have to resort to that? I was in Las Vegas for the showing of The Sound of Freedom about child trafficking in our country. And it was played by Jim Caviezel, who plays Jesus Christ in the movie, the Mel Gibson movie called The Passion of Christ. And what Jim Caviezel showed us when he came out on stage after the movie, we were given a VIP showing in Las Vegas. He came out and said child trafficking is now a bigger business in Oregon than drugs, sex trafficking, prostitution. He said there is more money being made from child trafficking in the country than any other way of making money is through child and sex trafficking. And we have a gal by the name of Christine Hutchison, I think. She's come up here to Oregon, to this area quite a few times. And she's been on the border, and she said the cartel is bringing children over the border as slaves. And they're being sold here in the United States, and they're being warehoused. And then they're being euthanized for selling their organs on the black market. right here in Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona. So children are being trafficked and being killed for their organs. And it's horrific, she said, what's going on. We've also heard stories of the adrenochrome, where people are, what's happening with the children's adrenochrome, children that have been housed between the ages of 9 and 12, and then have been drained of their adrenochrome, which comes from your blood products. So there's horrific things people don't want to talk about. But Oregon is one of the worst up and down the I-5 corridor of children disappearing, especially along Highway 58, children disappearing, children being trafficked out of the country through Portland, okay? So these are issues that the law enforcement and many of them, they are at their wits' end knowing what to do about it. And Jim Caviezel plays the part of Tim Ballard, who was actually working in Homeland Security on the border of California and Mexico, and a little boy was brought over the border by a pedophile, and he recognized that this was not this man's child. And they rescued the child, and the child goes, my sister was also taken. And, you know, and she was somewhere down in South America. And so the whole story is how Tim Ballard, went down there and rescued, I think it was over 58 children, and started an organization. And Jim Caviezel, who plays the part of Jesus Christ in The Passion of Christ, is actually plays the part of the actor in this movie. And Hollywood's been trying to keep us from releasing this movie for 2 years now. We're hoping to release it in February of 2023 here in the U.S., but it's called The Sound of Freedom, and it's a true story of child trafficking going on. And Jim Caviezel also said that he and Mel Gibson right now are about to make another movie, and it's to be called The Resurrection of Christ. So it's the second part of the story after Jesus Christ is resurrected. And he will be playing the part of Jesus Christ in that, and Mel Gibson is also putting that movie on too. So people need to understand the child trafficking, the drug trafficking that's going on here in Oregon, up and down the I-5 corridor. We have more illegals being brought into Oregon right now and seated by people like Kate Brown in Harney County, in Wallowa, okay? And we need to get to the end of this. And I'll tell you, I know none of these 3 women that are running against me for governor. They're telling you everything they think you want to hear to vote them in. And more people are voting for her rather because they're so afraid if she gets in. They're saying if these 2 get in,
right,
then we're in trouble. It'll be like Kate Brown 201, on steroids.
That is the biggest fear. It's like,
that is the biggest fear. So now
they're going to
the
give
fear
you
porn.
a good cop, bad cop scenario. So, everybody's going to vote for the good cop. Come to find out they're both cops.
Yeah, exactly. And so people are saying, we're going to vote for this one because we're afraid of these 2 who are actually both Democrats getting in. But we know she's a rhino, and they're saying we don't like her, we don't trust her. She sold us down the river while she was in the legislature. She threw us under the bus. She voted for defunding the police. She voted for tampons in the boys' restrooms in the public schools. She voted for this, she voted for that. But we're going to vote for the lesser of 3 evils. But some people are voting for me because they said we agree with Lavoie. It matters how you stand. We have to look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning. We're not going to vote any longer based on fear porn like we've been doing for the last 30 years. That's why our state's in the condition it's in, because we've had rhinos in the legislature. We have rhinos who have been leading us who don't care about Oregonians. And so those people who are voting for me are voting on principle, and they're voting on their morals and values and ethics. And they're voting because they know that I am the best leader for this job. And they know what's going to happen on Tuesday, but they know that I'm not going away because they're not going to let me go away. As governor, I wouldn't even take a paycheck. And I put this in writing, and it's going to be notarized. I will not take a paycheck as governor. I will not take medical benefits for myself and my family. I wanted to give that back to Oregonians because right now Oregon's been going through for the last 30 to 40 years an arterial bleeding. We can't use the Band-Aid approach any longer. We can't put up with the broken promises from the captured Republican Party here in Oregon and from the captured Democrat Party. The tourniquet has to be put in place, and it has to be released by experts, like you would in an emergency room. You put a tourniquet on a man who's in a car accident on I-5, you don't release that tourniquet. The fire department can't, the police department can't, the paramedics can't. Once that tourniquet goes on, you have to wait till the patient gets to your trauma unit, your ER, and then 3 or 4 experts will release the tourniquet safely, carefully, with the expertise, and making sure there's plenty of blood products and normal saline and everything. And when they release the tourniquet, they have to do it in a way where the person won't bleed out. So the same with Oregon. We need a tourniquet here. And we need to have the experts release that tourniquet. And we need to make sure that we start the healing of Oregon. And I don't see what's going to happen on Tuesday is going to heal Oregon in 4 years or in 8 years.
It's not just Oregon.
No, it's not just Oregon.
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping that people will understand that after Tuesday, whatever happens, we have to let go and let God and keep prayer at the head and pray for myself and pray for all the rest of us here that are basically, we're all in the same boat as you are, and we all love Oregon. Many of us, we know that many of us are transplants here, and many people came to Oregon because they chose to come to Oregon to live here. But the point is those of you that came from other states like California, don't come here to get away from California's problems and then create some of the same issues here in Oregon. So please go to DoniceSmithForOregon.com. That's DONICE like Donice. DoniceSmithForOregon.com. My website is there. And reach out to me. My phone number is 541-530-4718. I'm at the other end of that phone. Thank you.